Welcome to my channel, The Theory Geek. This is my series on reading up to Spivak, where I discuss various texts that are necessary, I believe, in the background for understanding Spivak's seminal essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? And this is my second episode, and I've titled it A Debt to Gramsci, and I think most of my listeners have by now already understood the two major concepts that I'm going to discuss in this series, in this episode of the podcast, that is hegemony and subalternity. Now, if there's one scholar or philosopher or thinker that must be isolated in our series reading up to Spivak, who perhaps deserves an entire episode on him or her, for that matter, I think we can unequivocally agree that that would be Antonio Gramsci. A Marxist thinker and a political activist, jailed for his activities in Italy by Benito Mussolini and his fascist party, and released after the liberation. Gramsci had very little time to actually investigate his ideas and see them in action or them used in the real world. Gramsci died soon after his release from prison, owing to his deterioration in his health during his time in prison. So most of what we know about him, or what we know of his writing, comes from what would later be called a collective of his journals that he wrote in the form of pamphlets during his time in prison, called the prison notebooks. Now, the prison notebooks were written during his prison starting in 1929, and they continued for most of his time there. And it's very important to know that he was writing in prison. I will come to it. His works, though diverse, essentially tries to study the nature and fundamental working principle of power. And in that capacity, he was basically studying how Italy, especially fascist Italy, came into being. His notion of hegemony, that is the first concept that we take from Gramsci, as hinted in my last episode already, is first elaborated in his Notes on Italian History, that was also a constituent part of his prison notebooks. And the idea that I will discuss in the latter part of this episode, that is the subaltern, because I realized that it is impossible to study this text by Spivak without actually delving into a discussion and a genealogy of the notion of the subaltern. It is actually very true that we owe a lot of debt to Italian Gramsci, and thus I justify my naming of this episode. He practically died and wrote in prison, and so yeah, I think we owe him quite a lot. So, hegemony. Hegemony, as we have already outlined, is a notion that entered into our understanding from Gramsci's Notes on Italian History, and the word derives from a Greek word meaning to dominate. In its simplest and perhaps a bit oversimplified sense, hegemony is the concept that is useful in understanding the domination of the lower classes by the ruling elite or the upper class. The basic idea that Gramsci here tries to address is why and how the upper class dominates the working class. Now, you might remember from your Marxism 101 that the working classes are kept in false consciousness, and that is what allows the ruling classes to dominate. Well, Gramsci essentially is a reworking on that thesis and offering some insight into how false consciousness works and how ideology works at the same time. Gramsci's ideology is essentially at its roots not but Marx's false consciousness laid bare to its basic mechanism. Gramsci is revolutionary in his approach to a certain extent in the discovery of how Mussolini and the fascist party managed to win power in Italy. He asks himself what sustains and what allows and propels such regimes to exist and perpetuate themselves, and he realizes that it is not arms or weapons that allow regimes to exist and continue, but ideology, and a certain manipulation of ideology and signs and symbols and language that makes the status quo the most normal and the most natural state of affairs. To provide an example, a rather topical example, let us look at the word non-binary as used in the gender discourse. The very fact that an additional prefix non is required in addition to the word binary is a mark of the normalizing or the naturalizing condition or the normalized and naturalized status of binary sexuality and binary gender relations. that the idea that sexuality is binary, male or female. I mean, if you don't know that, then probably you've been living under a rock, and you're probably listening to the wrong podcast. But anyhow, such linguistic maneuvers might sound far-fetched to the common English reader, but and the normal audience of my podcast, because I'm speaking in English, because they have been so normalized that they are commonsensical. But believe me, such linguistic maneuvers are impossible in other cultures, in other regions, in terms of space or even in terms of time. For example, pre-20th century China. Now, pre-20th century China actually recognizes 5 sexes and 5 genders instead of 2, based on the sexual function that somebody plays in the family, and not exactly on the basis of the sexual organs. The same goes for the term non-vegetarian, although why vegetarian in this case is normalized in spite of most non-Western Christian society being non-vegetarian would demand a substantial discussion of Heda, which I'm not exactly willing to go into at the moment. And other examples of this can be the term inhuman or non-human. It's also a prime example of our anthropocentric hegemony in the day-to-day discourses, the fact that human life and human actions is all that matters, and non-humans, so plants and animals, are somehow inferior, is also a kind of validation of this idea that language can be manipulated to hegemonize. And this is the power of hegemony, the power to normalize things, which also means that the denial of hegemony grants us the power to radicalize several issues. But how does the notion of normalization and grant power and dominance? Because humans, Gramsci found, rather like dogs and other animals, who live in, well, not the eternal present necessarily, but close to that. Why do we drink from a cup or eat from a plate? Why do we grow grass and not corn or rice in our urban gardens? Why do we write from the left to the right, well, again assuming you do, and not the other way? Or why do we not write in circles or from the top to bottom as the Chinese and the Japanese do, or did at one point? These are all markers that we do, and we don't even realize that we are doing, because they're so normalized. We do what is customary, what is normal, what is obvious, or in Gramsci's term, we do what is common sense. We follow common sense. And dominance comes from turning power relations, or to use the Marxist phrase, relations of production, commonsensical. So it takes a very strong effort, a Herculean imagination, and an imaginative effort to dream of an alternative condition. In a later reading of this issue, Jürgen Habermas would go on to reinterpret this idea and use it to understand the enduring hold and power of democracy on the European political scene, in spite of the widespread critique and multiple failings. This is because democracy has been normalized and naturalized as the ultimate political form and the epitome of all good in the course of political evolution. And hence, we can at best point to its failings, but we struggle to imagine a complete alternative. This is normalization. And through that, the attainment of dominance and winning a tacit consent by abrogating the alternative is what Gramsci means by hegemony. Now, the key term here is, of course, consent, because how Gramsci differs from several other thinkers in this tradition is that Gramsci asserts that the ruling classes rule with the consent of the masses, albeit a consent that is deceitfully won, but consent nevertheless, and not through weapons or ownership necessarily. The subaltern. Now, the second concept that we derive, in a way, from Gramsci is the subaltern. Now, in this section, I will draw a genealogy of the term, but it is actually quite fascinating to note how surprisingly and how accidentally the word has actually entered our academic parlance, how we receive the word subaltern, because the term subaltern actually means a junior non-commissioned officer in the army. When the Russians had actually translated the article, "Can the Subaltern Speak?", they had erroneously translated it as "Can the junior officer speak?". I hope it was subsequently modified and changed. But Gramsci, though, was actually using the word subaltern to refer to the proletariat in his prison notebooks and to evade censorship, because we must remember that Gramsci was writing in prison, and all of his writings were being checked, and it was, under conditions of censorship. So Gramsci was actually using the word subaltern to refer to the proletariat, and the word monism to refer to Marxism. Gramsci had studied the subalterns again, in his sense, the workers and the peasants, because he was just meaning the proletariat, in a sustained attempt to explain again why and how the ruling elite managed to rule over the rest of the population, the subalterns. The subalterns, in this process of the elite historiography of the nation state, is deprived of his agency to function as a subject in the nation state's history, because Gramsci sees the subaltern as not much different from the proletariat. It is poignant to point out that Gramsci saw the subaltern as autonomous. And Spivak disagrees in this sense by arguing that the subaltern are not an autonomous entity because they are not homogeneous. In the essay Can the Subaltern Speak, you can find this argument in paragraph 2, and throughout the text, but mostly in paragraph 2. The fact that they appear homogeneous is only in binary opposition to the ruling elite. They are a class by themselves, or they are a group by themselves, a single group, only because we are comparing them. We are comparing them to the ruling elite. So they are the subalterns because they're not the ruling elite, but within the subalterns they have multiple different interests and desires, so they are not a homogeneous body. And therefore the subaltern can never actually speak because it is defined in opposition to another cohort. It is not an affirmative designation. The subaltern doesn't have anything to speak because it's not a single body. It has multiple things to say. And now, it would be wrong to suggest that Spivak was the first to actually lift up Gramsci's notion of the subaltern and use it in a theoretical post-colonial sense. Ranajit Guha, on the other hand, might well deserve that credit. Although the prime text for Guha's understanding of the subaltern is the elementary aspects of peasant insurgency in colonial India, I will use Guha's other famous text, which I find to be slightly more readable and slightly more useful in this regard, The Small Voice of History, as focus for my discussion. But before we go into it, I would like to digress a bit and explain the idea of national historiography and the nation state in itself. The nation state in its original sense, in the European 18th and 19th century sense, that is, constitutes a historical community. Now, you might be familiar with Benedict Anderson's claim that the nation is an imagined community, but it is imagined on the basis of shared history, or the claim to a shared history. So it is a historical community, as I like to say, an imagined community which is forged on the basis of a shared history and a shared narrative. The question, therefore, is that the intellectual must ask is, whose history? And both Gramsci and Guha answer that to a certain extent in agreement in saying that it is the history of the bourgeois elite who have established hegemony and have won tacit consent to speak for, or to use Spivak's term, to represent, to speak for or to represent the rest, that is, the subalterns. But there's actually a caveat when it comes to Indian history and Indian historiography, as Guha points out, and this general idea runs into trouble actually when we deal with this. At the very beginning of his analysis, Guha asks, and I will quote to some extent at this point from the text, the citation of the text can be found in the description. What nominates certain events as historic and designates others as not? So his question essentially is that why is the life of, Napoleon, or why is the life of even Hitler, or Henry VIII, or Louis XIV, or Robespierre, why is the life of these people, or Metternich, why is the life of these people historical, and why is my life not? I mean, yeah, I am my own history. I have a history as well. So why is my life not historical, and the life of these people whom I have absolutely no idea how they were or what they did, why is that historical? Now, if I quote this section from The Small Voice of History, it's right at the beginning. He writes, "But who is it that nominates these for history in the first place? For some discrimination is quite clearly at work here, for some unspecified values and unstated criteria. To decide why any particular event or deed should be regarded as historic and not others. Who decides, and according to what values and what criteria? If these questions are pressed far enough, it should be obvious that in most cases the nominating authority is none other than an ideology for which the life of the state is all there is to history. It is this ideology henceforth to be called statism, which is what authorizes the dominant values of the state to determine the criteria of the historic. So what Guha essentially says is that it is this ideology of statism, that history is the idea of the state. So how the state evolves and how the state develops is the core content of history. So people like Robespierre, like Metternich, like Napoleon, like Hitler, who have been involved with the state. If you remember Louis XIV's assertion, King Louis XIV of France's assertion, I am the state. So his history is, of course, his life is the history of the state of France as he saw it. So this is the ideology of statism. Now, if we again digress a bit, we can reformulate this assertion in the language by saying that the history of Europe, in this case, the history is narrativized by the ideology of the state. So it is narrativized. The state is the prime actor in this history. The state is actor in this history in the sense that the state nominates events that are important to itself, the values of the state, for the category of history. So history is constituted by the state. I think the reader, the perceptive listener, by now has already caught my hint that I am referring to Spivak's first paragraph in her essay. The history of the West as subject is narrativized by the ideology, blah blah blah, law, politics, something of that sort. And that is what she means. It is narrativized in this sense, as just as history in general is narrativized by the state. History in that case is narrativized by the ideology of these ideas that she's talking about. Now, turning back to Guha discusses that how this came about is because of the humanist tradition of history that he draws up to Machiavelli and those people back in the 12th, 13th century, that history is narrativized by the state in the humanist tradition, because the pre-humanist tradition, history was narrativized by the church, by God. So history was the acts of God that you are actually studying. But when the humanists started to rewrite history as acts of man, it became the act of state, because history was consumed and produced by people who were in state positions because they wanted to learn from the past. Historia magistrae vita. History teaches life, so they wanted to learn from the past, and so this was the institutionalized form that history took when it kind of was started its life as a discipline. But the problem here is that, again, it is the people's history and the shared history which forms the nation state, is the community that the people form, and they nominate the elite, the bourgeois elite, to speak for them, to represent them. But when it comes to colonial historiography, as indeed Indian historiography that Ranajit Guha is actually worried about, we enter into a problem. So he already states in page 3, statism in Indian historiography was a gift of Western education. So this education, I just need to do the word Western here, Western or colonial education. The intelligentsia, its purveyors within the academic field and beyond, had been schooled in their understanding of the history of the world, and especially of modern Europe, as a history of state systems. In their own work within the liberal professions, therefore, they found it easy to conform to the official interpretation of contemporary Indian history simply as a history of the colonial state. But there is a fallacy about this interpretation, and here comes Guha's actual assertion. The consent which empowered the bourgeoisie to speak for all citizens in the hegemonic states of Europe was also the license used by the latter, that is the hegemonic states of Europe, to assimilate the respective civil societies to themselves. But no such assimilation was feasible under colonial conditions where an alien power ruled over a state without citizens, where the right of conquest rather than the consent of its subjects constituted its charter, and where, therefore, dominance would never gain the hegemony it coveted so much. So, it made no sense to equate the colonial state with India as constituted by its own civil society. the history of the latter would always exceed that of the Raj, and consequently an Indian historiography of India would have little use of statism. So what Guha at this point is critiquing is this idea that the history of the colonial state constitutes the history of India. So this is almost a kind of manifesto. I read it as the small verse of history, this text, this essay, as a manifesto, much more than peasant insurgency, because here he kind of lays bare what he means by by subaltern historiography, and what he tries to do and what he intends to do in the his Subaltern Studies Collective, or the Subaltern Studies group that he formed around him. This text is from 1982, so Spivak would certainly have been at least in possession or aware of this text, if not influenced and read this text when she wrote Can the Subaltern Speak? And there's actually much to it. So when Guha says the consent which empowered the bourgeoisie to speak for its citizens, he means hegemony. He's talking about the hegemony, because hegemony, as we have established, is this tacit consent. But in India, he says there is no consent, because the consent that was tacitly won was from the bourgeoisie, the collaborators who were collaborating with the East India Company and later with the British government in ruling India, and they were, albeit a minority. It was the consent won from them, not from the autochthonous people, not from the women, not from the ordinary people or the subalterns of India. So in the colonial sense, subaltern, and this is where Spivak, this is the sense that Spivak picks it up, in the colonial sense, the subaltern is more than the oppressor-oppressed dichotomy would allow, because the colonial elite in a way are also oppressed. Just as managers in the Marxist sense are also oppressed. They are oppressors, yes, but they are semi-oppressors. They are still oppressed by their managers or their further superior people. But then the subalterns are the people who have no access to history, because the colonial bourgeoisie still have access to history. They still have the means to identify themselves, to put themselves, to insert themselves in the colonial historiography of India, in the writing of history in the country. But these autochthonous people, the tribals, the workers, the miners, the women, they have no means to insert themselves. They do not share the same vocabulary. They do not share the same language, in a way. And I use language metaphorically, not literally language. They do not have the same. They do not share the same signs and symbols of power that are shared by the culture of power that the colonial state had built for itself, that is shared by the colonial bourgeoisie. So the colonial bourgeoisie or the colonial elite still have access to history, and they can write a revisionist history, and we know they did write revisionist history, because Indian history at first kind of was written by the imperial historiographers. So the imperial mode of history writing, the colonial mode of history writing, which saw Britain kind of doing everything in India, etc., kind of a hypodermic syringe model, and then came the nationalist school of Indian historiography, and that is the bourgeois school of historiography. There's the bourgeois elite school of historiography, where the people who have given consent to the state, the colonial state, are actually talking about all of it, but then they are actually representing the original people of India, the Indians, the subalterns, without actually having won their consent, because the right of conquest is the ruling ideology there, and the right of conquest was inherited in some ways by this colonial elite by granting consent to the actual people who won the right of conquest. I know this is very complicated, but it's not that complicated actually, if you kind of diagrammatically see it. And that is what the idea that Spivak inherits, that these people, the subalterns who cannot speak in Spivak's sense, are not people who have access to history, who are not people who can write the history of India in a way, because they are represented in the colonial discourse, they are represented in the imperial historiography and the nationalist historiography that came out of the bourgeois elite, and in both cases they are represented, they are not speaking. So if we recall some matter from the first episode of my series, they are the people who are reduced to objective status, and they are being studied by the subject, by the agent, that is the imperial historiographers and the nationalist school of historiography in India. So I think that is in some ways my discussion on hegemony and subalternity. It's very important to understand that hegemony and subalternity share a lot of concepts. Subalternity is not only established but also critiqued through the idea of hegemony. It's only by understanding hegemony that we can understand this concept of consent, this tacit consent that the state can win, and the absence of consent. There is no consent from the subaltern people in India. So in India, unlike in Gramsci's sense in Italy, we have three different layers. We have the ruling classes, we have the sub-ruling classes who have consent, who constitute civil society in India, the bourgeois elite who have granted consent to the rulers, and then there are the subalterns. So we have three layers instead of two layers, as Gramsci originally saw it. So that is my debt to Gramsci, actually, or our debt to Gramsci when we read Spivak. Gramsci was very profound and wrote a lot on other stuff. His work on education is actually very enlightening, and I hope to do a series on Gramsci specifically someday, but right at the moment I'm kind of busy with Spivak, so I'll let that pass. What I also wanted to say is that if the last comment box was empty because I forgot to set the options for comments, I think I can manage to open comments for this video, so if anybody has any questions, then I welcome them openly. And if you have questions otherwise, you're also very free to contact me on Facebook or otherwise. And I'm putting the quotations that I have and the citations from where I took those quotations in the description box, and please see them. And if you're interested in Spivak on the subaltern studies more generally and the roots of subaltern studies, please read the Small Voice of History, because I think it's a very great text, and it's a very good manifesto in some ways to the subaltern studies group. And I will be returning to the Small Voice of History also when I discuss this idea of narrativizing. I have briefly touched upon it in the first introductory episode, but again I will return to this text, and so it's very important that we keep it at hand. That is all for today, and I hope everybody is well in this difficult situation. And yeah, till next time. I think I will again catch up on subjectivity in the next episode, and then perhaps we'll move into the text a little more. So far we have actually covered, I know, 2 paragraphs in some ways, just 2 paragraphs, and this is a very dense text and it will take a very long time to do it, so just bear with me, and yeah, bye.